I want to start tonight by slowing this story way down. Because if you just skim the headlines, it probably sounded like another round of geopolitical noise. Trump threatens tariffs, Europe reacts, diplomats shake hands, contracts get signed. That's the surface. But underneath that surface is a much deeper economic story about power, leverage, and how capitalism actually works when a dominant country starts using economic threats instead of stability as its primary tool. And if you live in Canada, or work in manufacturing, or care about where good jobs come from and why they disappear, this story is very much about you. What officially happened looks simple enough. Donald Trump floated the idea of steep tariffs on Canadian goods, framing it as pressure, leverage, the usual strongman language about forcing compliance. At almost the same moment, European governments, most notably Sweden and Germany, announced major defense and industrial commitments involving Canada. Billion-dollar procurement decisions, strategic partnership agreements, and discussions about advanced manufacturing on Canadian soil. On paper, these things are separate. In reality, they are tightly connected. And that connection is what most mainstream coverage misses. Here's the part I want you to focus on. Tariffs are not just taxes. They are signals. When a large economy threatens tariffs against an ally, it is telling every investor, every manufacturer, every government agency something very specific. It is saying, your access to our market is conditional, political, and potentially unstable. Capital does not like instability. Supply chains do not like unpredictability. And workers, whether they know it or not, end up paying for that uncertainty through lost jobs, stalled investment, or weaker bargaining power. Now look at what Sweden and Germany did. Sweden arrives in Ottawa not just with royalty and speeches, but with defense companies, industrial planners, and long-term partnership frameworks. Germany chooses a Canadian-developed naval combat system over alternatives from much larger defense exporters. These are not symbolic gestures. These are procurement decisions that lock in relationships for decades. When a Navy chooses a combat system, it is choosing training pipelines, maintenance contracts, software updates, and political alignment far into the future. And here's where the economic logic kicks in. When the United States threatens Canada economically, it doesn't just pressure Ottawa. It raises the relative attractiveness of Canada to everyone else. Canada starts to look like the stable node in an unstable network, a place where contracts will be honored, trade rules won't change on a whim, and allies won't be treated as disposable bargaining chips. That perception has real dollar values attached to it. If you work in aerospace, shipbuilding, advanced manufacturing, or any sector tied to defense and high-end production, this matters directly to your future. These industries don't relocate overnight, but once they do move, they rarely come back. Tooling, skills, supplier ecosystems, and worker training all cluster around decisions like the ones Germany and Sweden are making right now. And this is where the story stops being about personalities and starts being about systems. Trump's tariff threats are not an accident or a misunderstanding. They are a feature of a political economy that treats trade as a weapon and allies as leverage points. That approach can produce short-term concessions, but it almost always produces long-term diversification away from the threatening power. Capital flows toward predictability. Governments hedge against risk.
Workers end up rebuilding their livelihoods around new supply chains, whether they voted for this strategy or not. You might be wondering why defense keeps showing up in this story. It's because defense spending sits at the intersection of public money, private profit, and geopolitical trust. When a country buys weapons systems, it isn't just buying hardware, it is buying into a political relationship. And right now, Europe is quietly recalibrating who it trusts to be a reliable partner. What's especially striking is that none of this required Canada to shout, threaten, or retaliate. The response was structural, not rhetorical. Review procurement. Signal openness to alternatives. Welcome partners who want to build locally rather than extract value remotely. That's how power actually shifts in modern capitalism, not through press conferences, but through supply chains and balance sheets. As we move forward in this conversation, I want you to keep one question in mind. When powerful countries use economic coercion instead of cooperation, who adapts first, governments or workers? And who pays the price while those adaptations play out? That question is at the heart of everything unfolding right now. And it's exactly what we're going to keep unpacking together. If you step back and look at the build-up to this moment, none of it is as sudden as it looks. Canada's position in the global economy has been quietly shifting for years, especially in sectors where the state plays a heavy role as buyer, regulator, and partner. Defense is one of those sectors, but so are clean energy, critical minerals, advanced manufacturing, and aerospace. These are industries where governments don't just set the rules, they are the market. And that means political trust matters, as much as price. For decades, Canada's defense and industrial strategy was built on an assumption of seamless integration with the United States. Shared supply chains, shared standards, shared procurement logic. That integration brought benefits, but it also created dependence. When you depend on a single dominant buyer or partner, you lose leverage. And most of the time, that loss of leverage is invisible to workers until something breaks. What Trump's tariff threats did was expose that dependence in a very public way. They reminded Canadian policymakers, firms, and unions that access to the American market is not guaranteed by geography or history. It is contingent on politics. Once that becomes clear, diversification stops being ideological and starts being practical. You don't diversify because you're angry. You diversify because your entire economic base depends on stability. Germany and Sweden understand this logic intimately. These are export-driven economies with long memories of what happens when trade relationships become politicized. When Germany chooses a Canadian naval system, it is not rejecting American technology because it is inferior. It is hedging against political risk. It is saying we cannot afford to have our fleet dependent on a supplier whose government might decide tomorrow that alliances are optional. And if you're a worker watching this, here's the part that really matters. Procurement decisions determine where factories get built, where engineers get hired, where apprenticeships exist, and where secondary suppliers cluster. A combat management system contract doesn't just mean software licenses. It means long-term maintenance work, updates, cybersecurity teams, and training pipelines. Those are jobs that last decades, not election cycles. The same logic applies to the fighter jet conversation hovering in the background. Fighter jets are not just machines. They are ecosystems. If jets are built domestically, that means tooling shops, composite manufacturers, avionics specialists, and logistics firms all grow around them. If they're imported as finished products, most of that value is captured elsewhere. When a government reviews a contract like that, it's not just weighing military capability. It's weighing where the economic spillovers land. This is where the class dimension comes into focus. Decisions framed as national security often determine whether working class and middle class jobs exist at all in certain regions. When those decisions default to foreign suppliers without domestic production, the gains accrue to shareholders and executives abroad, while domestic workers are told to be grateful for indirect benefits that never quite materialize. What Sweden is offering Canada, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, is something different. Co-production, shared supply chains, skills transfer, the kind of industrial policy that rebuilds capacity rather than hollowing it out. That doesn't mean it's altruistic. Sweden wants reliable partners and secure markets, but the alignment of incentives matters. When both sides gain,
from domestic production, the relationship is more resilient. And this is why tariff threats so often backfire in the long run. They reveal that economic relationships are not neutral. They force smaller partners to confront their vulnerability. And once that happens, the rational response is to reduce exposure. You don't need to punish the threatening country. You just quietly make yourself less dependent on it. The irony is that this shift often looks invisible until it's irreversible. By the time headlines announce a new factory, a new partnership, or a new procurement standard, the underlying decision was made years earlier in response to risk. Workers experience it as sudden change. Economists see it as path dependence finally snapping. So, as we keep going, I want you to think about how much of your own economic security depends on assumptions you never agreed to, but were built into the system anyway. Assumptions about trade stability, political restraint, and mutual respect between allies. Because when those assumptions break, the consequences ripple outward, reshaping industries, communities, and lives long after the initial threat fades. To really understand how this works, you have to look at the mechanics, not the speeches. Capital, especially in strategic industries, is constantly asking a quiet question in the background. Where is the risk lowest over the next 20 or 30 years? Not next quarter, not next election cycle, but over the lifespan of a factory, a weapons system, or a skilled workforce. When political leaders introduce volatility into trade relationships, that risk calculation changes immediately, even if nothing has been signed yet. Think about a defense firm deciding where to locate production. It has to invest upfront in machinery, training, certification, and regulatory compliance. Those costs only make sense if the firm believes market access will be stable long enough to recover the investment and turn a profit. If one partner starts hinting that access can be cut off for political reasons, even temporarily, that location becomes less attractive, not because of ideology, but because spreadsheets don't tolerate uncertainty. This is why Germany's procurement choice matters so much. On the surface, it's a technical decision about naval systems. Underneath, it's a signal about trust. Germany is effectively saying, we value partners whose political systems don't treat trade as a bargaining chip to be flipped on and off. And when a country like Germany sends that signal, other governments, firms, and financiers notice. It shifts expectations across the entire market. You see the same mechanism at work with Sweden's approach. By bringing industrial players alongside political leaders, Sweden is aligning state strategy with corporate investment. That coordination is something the United States used to excel at during the post-war period when industrial policy was implicit rather than taboo. Today, that coordination is frayed, replaced by rhetoric that treats markets as weapons rather than shared infrastructure. And here's where workers enter the picture again. When firms relocate or diversify supply chains, they don't do it to reward loyalty or punish bad behavior. They do it to protect margins. But the consequences land unevenly.
Workers in unstable jurisdictions face layoffs, while workers in perceived safe havens see new opportunities. None of this is democratic in the small sense. You don't vote on supply chain restructuring. You live with its outcomes. Canada's response, whether intentional or instinctive, has been to position itself as a low-drama partner. That sounds boring, but boring is incredibly valuable in global capitalism. Predictable regulations, consistent alliances, and a refusal to escalate trade conflicts make a country attractive to long-term investors. It's the opposite of the shock and awe approach to economics, and over time, it often wins. There's also a feedback loop here that doesn't get enough attention.
Once a country begins attracting high-value industrial investment, it builds political constituencies that defend that stability. Workers, unions, regional governments, and local suppliers all become stakeholders in maintaining reliable trade relationships that makes future disruptions less likely, reinforcing the perception of safety that attracted the investment in the first place. Meanwhile, countries that rely on threats and volatility generate the opposite dynamic. Firms hedge, diversify, or leave. Workers lose leverage. Regions dependent on those industries become more fragile. Political leaders then respond with more threats, blaming outsiders for outcomes produced by their own strategy. It's a cycle, and it's one we've seen before in different forms. So when you hear about defense contracts and strategic partnerships, don't think of them as abstract geopolitics. Think of them as plumbing. Invisible most of the time, but absolutely decisive when it fails.
Right now, parts of the global economic system are quietly rooting around perceived blockages. And once those pipes are laid, the flow rarely returns to its old path, no matter how loud the shouting gets later. At this point, it's worth talking directly about responsibility, because systems don't operate themselves. They are shaped by choices made by people with power, acting within incentives they often pretend not to control. Trade policy didn't suddenly become volatile by accident. It was turned into a political weapon deliberately as a way to signal toughness and extract concessions. That strategy has authors, advocates, and beneficiaries, even if the costs are diffused across millions of workers who never consented to it. When a political leader threatens tariffs against an ally, they are not just pressuring a foreign government. They are intervening in the private decisions of firms that depend on stable cross-border flows.
They are telling CEOs, investors, and procurement officials that long-term planning is now subordinate to short-term political theater. Some firms can absorb that risk. Many cannot. And when they can't, they quietly look for exits. What's striking in this case is how measured the European response has been. There's no public confrontation, no moral grandstanding, just decisions. Procurement here, partnership there, co-production discussions behind closed doors that later surface as fate's accomplice. That's how institutional power expresses itself when it's confident. It doesn't need to shout. And you should notice something else. European leaders keep referencing reliability, predictability, and shared values. Not in an abstract sense, but in a very practical one. Shared values in this context mean honoring contracts, respecting allies, and not using economic pain as leverage against partners. These are not lofty ideals. They are operational requirements for complex industrial systems. For workers, this distinction matters. A system built on threats creates instability that weakens bargaining power. A system built on long-term coordination creates space for training, career ladders, and regional development. When governments choose one over the other, they are implicitly choosing what kind of labor market they want to sustain. Canada's political leadership didn't invent this opening, but it did recognize it. Reviewing major procurement decisions sends a signal without blowing up relationships. Welcoming European co-production frames diversification as cooperation rather than retaliation. That tone matters because it keeps doors open while shifting leverage. It's a lesson in how middle powers survive in a world where giants behave erratically. There's also a cautionary note here. Defense-led industrial policy can entrench inequalities if it isn't paired with strong labor standards and public accountability. High-tech jobs don't automatically translate into broad-based prosperity. Without unions, training pipelines, and regional investment, the gains can concentrate just as sharply as the losses they replace. The difference is that this time, there is at least an opportunity to shape outcomes deliberately, rather than accept them passively. This is where the wider consequences come into view. If Europe increasingly sees Canada as a stable hub for transatlantic production, that alters bargaining dynamics across multiple sectors. It affects energy, minerals, data infrastructure, and research collaboration. It also changes how smaller countries think about aligning with large powers. Stability becomes a competitive advantage. And that should prompt a deeper question for anyone watching from the United States. What happens to a country's influence when it treats interdependence as a weakness rather than a strength? Power in modern capitalism doesn't just come from size. It comes from being embedded in systems others rely on in trust. Once that trust erodes, no amount of bluster can easily replace it. We're watching that erosion play out in slow motion, not through collapse, but through substitution. One contract at a time, one partnership at a time. And the people who will feel it most on all sides are the workers whose livelihoods are tied to decisions they never got to debate. I want to pause here and bring the human side back into focus, because it's easy to get lost in abstractions like procurement and strategy and forget what those words translate into on the ground. When we talk about thousands of potential aerospace or defense manufacturing jobs, we're talking about people planning their lives. We're talking about whether a town keeps its tax base, whether a young worker sees a future in skilled trades, whether an older worker can transition into a new role without starting over from nothing. For workers in Canada, especially in regions that have lived through deindustrialization before, this moment carries a mix of hope and skepticism. They've heard promises about jobs before. They've watched deals get announced and then quietly hollowed out through outsourcing or automation. That skepticism is healthy. It's the product of lived experience in a system that often prioritizes capital mobility over community stability. For workers in the United States, there's a different kind of anxiety. When production shifts or supply chains diversify away, it can feel like betrayal. Even when the underlying cause is political volatility rather than worker productivity, that resentment is often misdirected downward or outward instead of upward toward the decisions that made those shifts rational in the first place. And that misdirection is not accidental. It's how political narratives keep people divided while structural forces do their work. This is why it matters to say clearly that no group of workers benefits when trade becomes a weapon. The winners are not factory workers or engineers. The winners are political actors who gain short-term leverage and firms agile enough to arbitrage instability. Everyone else lives with the churn. There's also a moral dimension that tends to get buried. Countries like Sweden and Canada are responding not just to tariffs, but to a broader sense that collective security and mutual obligation are fraying. When alliances feel transactional, trust erodes. And when trust erodes, institutions built on cooperation start to wobble. Defense partnerships, trade agreements, research collaboration, all of it rests on the assumption that today's commitments will still matter tomorrow. The shift we're seeing is not a rejection of globalization. It's a reconfiguration of it. Supply chains are not disappearing. They are being rewired around perceived reliability. That rewiring can either reinforce inequality or mitigate it. Depending on how states intervene left to the market alone, the benefits will concentrate. Guided by policy, they can be spread. This is where labor, civil society, and local governments have a role to play. Industrial strategy without democratic input risks reproducing the same imbalances under a different flag. If public money is going to anchor private investment, the public should demand something in return. Good wages, training guarantees, regional development, environmental safeguards. These are not obstacles to competitiveness. They are conditions for legitimacy. And this brings us to the uncomfortable truth at the center of the story. The instability driving these shifts was not imposed by fate or foreign enemies. It was generated by political choices made in full view of their likely consequences. The people making those choices will rarely bear the cost. Workers always do. So, as you watch this unfold, I want you to resist the urge to see it as a simple win or loss for any one country. It's a case study in how power operates when trust breaks down, and how quickly the ground can move beneath ordinary people when leaders treat economic relationships as tools of intimidation rather than shared commitments. The final piece of this puzzle is what it tells us about the system itself, and that's where we need to go next. So, the question I want to leave you with is a simple one. Even if the answer isn't, what kind of economic relationships actually make you safer? Ones built on fear and leverage, or ones built on mutual dependence and accountability. Because every contract signed, every partnership formed is an answer to that question, whether it's framed that way or not. If you want to keep unpacking stories like this, stories that look technical on the surface but shape real lives underneath, stay with me. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks trade wars are just tough talk. And make sure you're subscribed so we can keep making sense of how power, economics, and class really interact in the world you're living.